So this month, we are focusing on neurodiversity. Now, within the committee, I am the neurodiversity champion, and the reason that I am, and the reason this is important to me, is I have neurodiversity in my family, and I want to try and do whatever I can, no matter how small, to make the world a more accepting and kind place for neurodiverse people, and also help people realise the enormous untapped talent that there is in this huge group of people and what they have to offer the workforce and society in general. So today we are lucky enough to be joined by Genius Within. We started working with Genius Within last year when we organised a session for parents in the industry who are homeschooling neurodiverse children, and Genius Within helped us organise that session. So today we have with us two fantastic business psychologists, Georgina Wong and Emily Morris. Now, both Georgina and Emily have the most enormous list of professional qualifications and accolades that are just too long for me to list here, but they both specialise in working with neurodiverse people, with people with mental illnesses and different challenges, and helping them achieve their full potential, and helping companies and employers also help their employees reach their full potential as well. And so they are going to be taking us through the session today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we move forward. Sorry, I'm just admitting someone else. This is a Zoom call, not a webinar. And the reason that we do things in Zoom calls is we think it gives a slightly nicer feel, but makes people feel a bit more connected. But it does mean that you will need to stay on mute, please. And if you want to ask questions, then there's going to be a Q&A session at the end. So you can raise your hand and I will sort of select you and you can unmute yourself. And you can also ask questions throughout on the chat. And there's also going to be some interactive elements as well, where Emily and Georgina are going to ask a few questions to try and get everyone's views. And so they will be conducted in the chat. And if there's any potential for interaction, then Emily and Georgina can work with me and we will sort of guide that. So that's I think that's everything. So I will stop my screen share and hand over to Georgina and Emily. Over to you. You will need to unmute yourselves. Everyone's been muted.
Sorry. There you go. I did not know that. Thank you, Kirsty. First technical faux pas averted. Emily, do you want to start? I'll start sharing the screen and you can start talking. That'd be great.
So I'm Emily Morris. I'm an occupational psychologist, as is George, my colleague. And I just wanted to say we're really delighted to be able to talk to you today. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to do that. And also, in terms of questions, there's no such thing as a silly question. So just ask what you want. If we don't know, we will find out, basically. So what will we be doing today? What we're going to be looking at is what are hidden disabilities and what is neurodiversity. We're going to be looking at exclusion, why exclusion happens and what legislation there is around it. And I'm going to then hand over to George, who'll be talking about systemic inclusion and universal design. And both of these are aimed at reducing exclusion in the workplace and in life, really. And both of us are really passionate about neurodiversity and addressing exclusion. So I really hope that comes across. I would also like to say that we're not employment law experts. So we are familiar with the law from our kind of experience of working in this field for many decades. But this really isn't a substitute for seeking legal advice. So do that if you need to. Also, you'll hear us use various terms such as neurodiverse and neurominority. People in this field often have very strong views about the terms they prefer, and these are just kind of the ones that we use. And really a good sort of practice is to ask people which terms they prefer. Also, there may be some of you that are listening to this abroad, whether now or later. So we'll be using terms such as manager, which I understand in some countries is supervisor, and also using the terms accommodations and adjustments kind of interchangeably, really. So before we go on to the next slide, I'd just like to pose you a question, which is what percentage of disabilities you think are hidden? So feel free to give your views to that in chat, and I'll just wait for a little while. So what percentage of disabilities do you think are hidden? Okay. I can't see the responses, but hopefully we've got some. Have a guess.
I can read out some of the responses if you'd like.
Go on, yes, please.
So they range from 20% to 94%.
Wow.
Quite a few 70s, quite a few 80s.
Yeah, okay, excellent. That's not a bad guess, actually. George, do you want to go on to the next slide? Basically, it's 90%. So 94% is really not a bad guess. So 90% of disabilities are not visible and are hidden disabilities. They're really not visible. And in addition, 1 in 7 of those people with a hidden disability have mental health needs. And that in the UK is a cost to the economy of 26 billion each year. Any ideas what that cost might kind of include? Don't know if anyone's put any answers.
We have rehab as an answer.
Yep. Yep, rehab.
Sports, stress, therapy,
yeah.
counselling.
Yeah. So some of those costs will be in terms of treatment, but some may also be in terms of absence, drops in productivity, having to recruit somebody else, maybe temporarily, retraining, that kind of thing. Okay, so those can be the potential costs. So what are we talking about in terms of hidden disability? So neurodiversity is a hidden disability. And what do we mean by that term? I don't know if any of you know who first used that term, but basically it was coined by somebody called Judy Singer. Now, Judy is a sociologist and she's the originator of the term, and she wrote a great book called Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea. It's available on Amazon. Obviously, other bookstores sell it too. But she has autism, her daughter has autism, and her mother have it. And she wrote about its impact and how it excludes people kind of socially, economically, and academically. And also, she discussed the fact that, and the concept really, that neurocognitive variation is a naturally occurring thing. So you might be thinking, what on earth is neurocognitive variation? So cognition is the way we take information in from the outside world. It's our brain functioning, the way our brain kind of works and processes information. And neurocognitive variation is about differences. So as a species, we're all different from each other. Some of us can sing and some of us can't. I can throw, but I can't catch, things like that. So some of us can sing, some of us can't. We're different from each other. We all vary from what we can do well and what we might find more difficult. I vary from you and you vary from me, and that variation is natural. Individuals also have their own neurocognitive variation. So some people are really good at things and find other things more challenging. If you're neurotypical, then all of your skills will be around the same. So you may have some strengths and weaknesses, but they're really not going to vary that much. And you'll see on this slide, can you see there's like a dotted line? That's average. And the green line is the sort of plotting of somebody's cognitive results. So the things they're good at and the things their weaknesses are. And you can see that that green line doesn't really vary very much. And if I assess somebody who's neurotypical using the test, then I would be able to plot that like that. So the difference between what they can do and what they can't do is not actually that big. If you're neurodiverse or in a neurominority, then the plot of your cognitive skills are the purple ones. So you can see that it's really spiky. So the gap between the things you can do and the things you find hard is statistically larger than most people have. There's a large variation. And you can see for some people that would cause quite a lot of sort of frustration. You know, I can do this, I can listen in a meeting, I can understand everything. Why can't I remember it? Why can I do this and I can't do that? So people who are neurodiverse have these spiky profiles, we call them, these sort of peaks and troughs. And the pattern of these kind of leads to the diagnosis. So yes, that's neurodiversity, that kind of spiky profile. I have strengths and I have areas that I find difficult. And often, actually, in terms of neurodiversity, it's difficulties with things like working memory, processing speed, things like that. And working memory is, well, you're using your working memory now. Working memory is about retaining information for a short while and then being able to do something with that. So mental arithmetic, you know, you're remembering the question and then you're having to give a response. Sitting in a meeting and taking notes, you're using your working memory. And that's the kind of thing that we test. So the difficulty is that variation is a normal thing, but the world isn't kind of built for that sort of flexibility, and normal, that sort of neurotypical profile, is dominant. And the world's not really built for big variations. So if we go on to the next slide, so what's included under the term neurodiversity? So the first image you'll see, a top left, purple one, that's an applied neurodiverse conditions. These are dyslexia. DCD stands for developmental coordination disorder, or you might know it as dyspraxia. So that's difficulties with things like coordination, organizing yourself, time management, things like that. Dyscalculia is significant difficulties with maths and kind of the whole concepts of maths and numbers. Dysgraphia is difficulties with fine motor control, which may affect things like handwriting and things. So with those conditions, you're typically born with them. You'll have inherited them, you're born with them. And they're really about skills and things that related to specific skills. So dyslexia related to the skill of reading. If we look at the next one on the top right, that's also a condition. These are also conditions you're born with. And these are clinical neurodiverse conditions. So we have here Tourette's syndrome, which is when you may have physical or verbal tics, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These are all neurodiverse conditions related to behaviours, such as things like if you have ADHD, you may have difficulties with impulse control, and autism is related to some issues with communication. Both of those top two are considered, well, the one on the right is considered a health condition and the one on the left isn't. If we turn our attention to the bottom two images, so you might be surprised to see that we've included mental health conditions under the banner of neurodiversity. And that's a reason for this. The idea of this is, well, the bottom two, both of them are acquired. So somebody is potentially neurotypical, and then something has happened which has meant that they're now neurodiverse. So I do occupational health assessments, and I may be asked to go out and assess somebody who wants to return to work who has a mental health condition, or who's struggling, who has a mental health condition. And when I see them, often what they will say is, I just can't remember anything, or I have brain fog, I just can't concentrate on anything. My mind is just kind of flitting from thing to thing. And I would assess them, and with using cognitive tests, and I'd be looking to see what their memory and their processing speed would be like. And it may well be affected if they have a mental health condition. And that clearly may well be affecting, well, it's going to affect their confidence and may well be affecting their performance at work. So they're likely to need support. And it can be very distressing for somebody if that happens. So the idea would be that as their health improves, so with their cognitive functioning, basically, their working memory would improve, their processing speed. would improve. And then moving to the purple image on the right, bottom of the right corner, that's also an acquired neurodiverse conditions of neurological illnesses or brain injuries. So if somebody had a road traffic accident, for instance, or potentially a stroke, then there may be a part of their brain that would be affected. And that then would lead to them being neurodiverse, because maybe the part of the brain that covers things like memory and things may well be damaged. Or neurological illnesses such as MS. You know, often the cognitive effects of things like MS can be forgotten, and a lot of times the focus is on the physical issues that might be related to MS. So that's also, both of those is also developed in response to a health condition. And again, if there was any improvement in the condition, that we would expect that to neurodiversity to disappear. Okay, so I was actually going to ask you what percentage of people you thought were neurodiverse. It's all right, George, don't worry. I've already shown it. So it's 15 to 20% of the population are neurodiverse. I don't know what people's reactions is to that, whether or not you're surprised. So yeah, quite high. What this slide is really about is it builds on the theme that these neuro differences have positives. What we can see here are the strengths associated with each neurodiverse condition. So you'll see we have ADHD there. Often people relate, well, they think of people with ADHD and they think, oh, they must have significant concentration issues. Yes, they may well do. However, they also have the ability to hyperfocus. I don't know if you've heard of that term, but hyperfocusing is the ability to really be completely concentrating on a task and be almost oblivious of everything around you. I assessed a student last week who's training to be a fashion designer. And she is able, when she's focusing on her designs and her work, she can focus for hours. And she may often focus for 5-6 hours and actually forget to eat or drink, which is obviously not great. But during that time, she's intensely creative and really, really productive. And you can see, you know, have a look at the other ones. For instance, we've got dyslexia here. You may well be, if you have dyslexia, some of your strengths may be very, very creative. If you're interested in learning a bit more about the positive strengths related to any neurodiverse conditions, really recommend a book by Thomas Armstrong, 2011. He wrote a book called The Power of Neurodiversity. And he looked at each different neurodivergent condition and said why each has a benefit to society. And when Genius Within when we do our assessments for people, we very much focus on strengths-based assessments, and which I think is really vital, because often people have had, you know, the focus has been on maybe a performance issue, what they can't do, and maybe, you know, their confidence has really been affected by that. But if you can actually focus on strengths as well, that will build people's confidence up. It's really, really important to understand that there are strengths as well, really significant strengths that are highly relevant, you know, to the workplace and to education and academia as well. The other thing to notice about this slide is, can you see that they're kind of overlapped? And the reason for that is that many of these neurodiverse conditions overlap. So for instance, autism and ADHD, there is large numbers of people that have both. Dyslexia and ADHD, you can see all around, they're kind of overlaps. The issue can be is that often people are referred for dyslexia assessments. Fine, referred for dyslexia assessments, they get their diagnosis, they have reasonable adjustments put in the workplace. However, if they are just referred for dyslexia assessments and the assessor doesn't do any screenings for anything else, other things might well be missed. And you can see from an employer's point of view and for an individual's point of view, that's really frustrating, because they may well need other areas of support that haven't been put in place, because actually maybe they have another neurodiverse condition that hasn't really been kind of considered. And what I would say is that if you are going to pay for assessments, do make sure that any assessor that does it really covers the whole gamut. And what we tend to do is use recognised questionnaires and things that will see if any of the other neurodiverse conditions are present enough for us to focus on them. And the other thing as well is there's often big misdiagnosis as well. So it's often not about the label, but really about asking people how it affects them. There's racial and gender bias at play here. So for women, traditionally, the tools used for autism and for ADHD often were based on how it affected men and young boys. So very gender biased, and it may not affect women and girls in the same way. And as a result, you may well find that people aren't diagnosed when actually they really needed to be. So they overlap, and it's really not about stereotyping or assuming that people will have certain characteristics, but it's really about treating people as an individual and asking, what works best for you? What do you think your strengths are? How do you think this affects you? And it's also about the idea that people aren't broken, that people have strengths who are neurodiverse, and that as a society, we really need them. We need different people in organisations. We need different people in teams. So yeah, we should focus on the benefits as well. And also arguing about the incidence. Okay, so anybody have any idea about the percentage of people that have autism, for instance, in the general population? You want to put that in the chat? And the percentage of people with dyslexia, ADHD and dyspraxia. Any ideas? So autism, dyslexia, ADHD and dyspraxia.
We're having a range of answers, Emily. We've got things like 8% for autism, 30%, 20%, 10. Yep. Ranging from 10 to 30, I'd say.
Okay. So for autism, the percentage of people is 2%, the general population. For dyslexia, it's 10%. For ADHD, it's 5%. And for dyspraxia, it's 2%. So quite high, really. So there must be benefits because, just because of the sort of high prevalence, really. So moving on to the next slide. So at Genius Within, what we've done, and hopefully you might have seen some of our awareness campaign kind of running across our social media channels. And if you don't follow us, please do. And our CEO, Nancy, who I think is listening onto this, hi Nancy, she's very vocal in terms of social media, and she writes some great blogs for Forbes as well. So do go and check them out. But this was an awareness campaign that we ran, and hopefully the message of this comes across. But the real focus was on changing perceptions, and I was actually blown away by some of these. Somebody who has kind of got blue-green eyes, that Tourette's is more common than having green eyes, which I thought was a really interesting fact. And the idea is really just thinking of these are differences. These are differences that people have, and kind of drawing a parallel between neurodiverse conditions and physical traits to reduce exclusion. It's just positive reframing, really, on their perspective. If I think about it, for instance, so the people having green eyes, I know people that have green eyes, but do I know anyone who has Tourette's? I think I know one person, but that's just why it is so hidden, really, and it's just differences. You have green eyes, I don't, that's blah blah. So yeah, that's our awareness campaign, and it's all about really hoping to address exclusion with these sorts of campaigns. Okay, so moving on. These these dates coming up are the years that various countries had their first disability rights legislation. What struck me again when I looked at this was it's relatively recent. I think the first one's what, 1985, if I can read that properly. So actually not that long ago. What's happened in terms of legislation is that most countries have kind of aligned themselves with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which came out in 2006. So there was some legislation before that, but that came out, the UN Convention legislation came out, and then all the countries kind of aligned themselves with it. So in the UK, for instance, that's the main reason why we've gone from the Disabilities Discrimination Act to the Equality Act of 2010. If you do want to go back to source, by the way, the UN Convention has a really good website, actually. It was very clear, I thought. So what the UN Convention talks about is that individuals with disabilities have human rights and what those human rights are. And it also adopts a really broad definition of disability, and it talks about accommodations and adjustments in life. And life meaning everything, meaning education, employment, being able to go to cinema, all those sorts of things. So a need for those accommodations and adjustments in an individual's life. And it also talks about the concept with universal design, and I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but that's defined on the site as the design of products, environments, programs and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptations or specialised design. And George is going to go into that in much more detail, but what's happened as a result of the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that neurodiversity is a recognised disability now in most developed nations, which is great. So it should mean that people are protected from discrimination by the law. And in the UK, obviously, we've got the Equality Act, as I've said. What hasn't happened is the idea of and the adoption of universal design. Can anyone think of something that has been brought about as a result of universal design? So the idea that society changes rather than the person change, that something has been designed to suit everybody. Anybody take a guess at what that might be? Any ideas?
There's nothing coming through on the chat. I think everyone is stumped and you need to
Yes, no problem. It's the ramps. So the adaptations to buildings, so physical ramps and things, that's kind of what we've done. But that idea of universal design really is coming over the horizon. So one of the things I actually have on my laptop, so Microsoft has taken this on board. And what it's done is built in accessibility to its programs, into all of its programs. So I've got Microsoft 10, I've got text-to-speech and voice recognition. If you've got Microsoft 10, by the way, do go and have a look because I found it by accident, so it's probably on yours. I have dyslexia, I'm neurodiverse. I haven't had to purchase anything or be assessed for it. It's all there for me to use, and it's been kind of life-changing. I can now hear text, I can proofread by listening to my things, and I can dictate what I do through voice recognition. Other things, so Instagram, there's now a big thing, isn't there, for people to do captions and writing when they're doing their stories. Videos now have captions. So the idea of accessibility for all is kind of being brought into all sorts of things that we now have, but it's been happening slowly. But what about ads? I don't think they don't all have captions. In fact, I don't think any do, if I think about it. So that hasn't been adopted, the idea of universal design, but it's coming, it's kind of around the corner really. And also the legislature hasn't provided the disability employment gap. It hasn't prevented, rather, the disability employment gap. So that idea that people who are disabled are not as employed as much as other people. And I've got some slides coming up which will show that. and that's still a big concern. So moving on, if we're looking at exclusion, I'm going to talk about direct discrimination, and I'm going to talk about indirect discrimination. I'm not sure how many of you will be aware of the differences. So here are some examples of direct discrimination. So we have compliance with the legislation, which should be there to prevent discrimination, but what I'm saying is that discrimination still exists. And here are some forms of that direct discrimination. And direct discrimination is being treated differently or worse for who you are, who others think you are, and who you are with. So one form of that is making assumptions about capability and treating people differently as a result. So if I give you an example of that I encountered probably about 2 weeks ago, I did an assessment for somebody who takes emergency calls for the 999 service, and I diagnosed her with ADHD. She told her manager about the diagnosis, and before she had the report, her manager immediately said that she would need to come off the phones because it'd be too noisy and distracting for her in that kind of environment. And my client was understandably really, really upset. And she wasn't long in the organisation. She was really worried about her job prospects, just being kind of hauled off the phones, basically. And what happened there was the manager had made assumptions about how her disability affected her and what she needed. And so the way I addressed that was that I offered to have a conversation with her manager and with her, just the three of us to talk that through, and also reassured the client that absolutely she knew that wasn't correct, but she wasn't sure how to handle it. But you can see about how making assumptions about capability or reasonable adjustments someone needs can lead to big issues, particularly based on what I've said about overlap of conditions and how it can actually affect people differently. So next one is a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and that still unfortunately does happen. So again, if I give you an example of that, some people who are autistic, one of the issues can be sensory overwhelm. So things like noise and smells causing kind of a feeling of being bombarded and being overwhelmed. And there was an autistic employee who was sat near the coffee station in the stairwell. So noisy because people going up and down the stairs, and smelly because people were heating up their smelly kedgeree in the microwave or something. So he asked to be seated in the corner of the office because that way he was away from those, and it would reduce the impact on him and how he's performing at work and his distress, really. But the reply came back that if he was told if I allow you to move, then everyone would ask to be moved, and so you can't. And we do see quite a few instances of failure to making those reasonable adjustments. And then another form is victimization. So this is unwanted behavior, which is violating dignity, being degrading, humiliating, hostile, things like that. If I give you an example of that, there was an employee who was sitting next to a man using Dragon software, and the employee told the person using Dragon software that he'd never learn to spell if he was carried on cheating. But the issue there is he didn't need to learn how to spell. Software did that for him, and he wasn't cheating. He felt awful as a result of that. So 3 examples of direct discrimination. If we move on to indirect discrimination. So indirect discrimination is where there's a practice, policy or rule applied to everyone in the workplace that affects some people more unfairly than others, in a negative way, far more than others. So if I give you an example of that, I assessed an accountant 2 weeks ago, and he works for one of the big accountancy firms, and they have a policy that everyone has to get their expenses in on time. And if not, if they don't, then they're marked down in terms of performance, and they're not likely to, well, it's going to affect their bonus, and also they may not get their expenses paid. Now, my client has dyslexia and dyspraxia, and he finds it very difficult to get all that information in. He finds the system really, really complex to navigate and doesn't understand it. And he forgets when he needs to get all the information in by. In addition, what's happened is, because he knows he finds it hard, he now panics when he knows he needs to hand that in. So what I suggested in my report was that we set up some co-coaching, so some coaching between him and his manager and one of our coaches. So just to foster some understanding in how it was for him, what he found hard, and why he might find it difficult. Also some coaching on the system and some support to set up reminders of deadlines. And our coach also gave him suggestions and some support around techniques to feel calmer when he was doing his expenses. So that's all fine. You know, he's got the support that he needs. He's got the reasonable adjustments. However, it would clearly be easier if maybe the accountancy firm looked at their practices as a whole. But I understand there might be some organisational reasons for doing that, as they have done. So yeah, a general policy that's affecting my clients kind of more unfairly. And if we look at the images on this diagram, what you'll also see is that equality is not actually kind of fairness. Treating everyone the same is not necessarily fair. So if we assume everyone needs the same adjustment, or as this image shows, a box to stand on, some people just won't see over the fence. If you give some people an individual adjustment, here, a taller box, some people will see over the fence. So this is basically about compliance. I've seen the need, I provided a reasonable adjustment, I've given you a taller box. But if you change the fence, then everyone can see through it, so there's no need for individual adjustments. And that's kind of systemic inclusion, really. That's what we're talking about. So universal design, that's what we're aiming for. Being able to see through the fence and not needing that box. Before we go on to the next slide, just want to quickly ask you, anybody, so we talked about exclusion and we talked about discrimination, but what are the facts? Does anybody know what percentage of unemployed people are dyslexic? Quick guess.
I've guessed at 50. 20, 60, 80, 35, 20, quite high.
Okay,
30.
so we've got 28% of long-term unemployed people are dyslexic. So if you think that's 10% of the general population are dyslexic, that's clearly disproportionate. And 10 to 15% of people who are autistic have a job. And again, that's, you know, there's clearly an issue there. And out of those people, 16% of autistic people have a full-time job. And those figures from the National Autistic Society. So people are overrepresented in the unemployment figures. And if we go on to the next slide, there's also a disproportionate number of people with ADHD in prison. So 25% of prisoners have ADHD, so that's a quarter of all prisoners have ADHD, which is just mind-blowing, really, when you think that 3 to 5% of the general population have ADHD. Okay, so moving on to what we're striving for, because I've already talked about what the issues are. We're striving for inclusion, so feeling part of an organisation, society, community, having access to education, having access, fair access to employment. What these images are, these show the different levels of inclusion. So I talked about kind of discrimination and exclusion. That's the first image. This is about people excluded from employment and from realising their potential in employment and in education. And I've already said neurodiverse people are overrepresented in those figures. The world of work, and also in some respects the world of education, is excluding. And then the second image is compliance. So that's kind of where we are now in the UK. I have an individual. He said he's dyslexic. I'm going to refer him for an assessment and give him some reasonable adjustments. So it's a reactive process. And in some respects, it's okay because the person has a support, but it's also not because it is so reactive. And the issue we often see is that clients, when they come to us, have no confidence. Maybe their relationship with their manager's broken down. Maybe they've been stopped from doing their duty, so their knowledge is kind of rusty. And they've been taken off doing what they do. I assessed a driver the other day. A trained driver, he'd been taken off from doing an error. He had ADHD. He was taken off and not allowed to drive for 6 months, all because they thought it was down to his ADHD. In fact, his marriage had broken down and he wasn't sleeping. That's why he'd made the error. And the cost of retraining that driver is going to be huge. So in the UK, we're somewhere between exclusion and compliance currently. If we go to the third image, this is about deliberate inclusion. This is where people have a particular neurodiverse condition are deliberately hired for specific roles, such as hiring autistic people to be coders. So on the plus side, I've said that the employment figures amongst autistic people are lower, but the downside is it's still kind of not really inclusive. It's otherizing. I'm going to employ you for these particular characteristics and put you in a box over there. They're a special team. And how included do people really feel in terms of the organisation? And really the holy grail is the last one, so that's systemic inclusion. And this is when we're flexible about the way we recruit and the way we design jobs and the way that the organisation is. And I also think COVID is a chance to really review what we do and change terms of changes to do all of this. So yeah, systemic inclusion is really what we need to be focusing on. And this is maybe a chance that we can do it. And George will be looking at this in more detail. So over to George.
Thanks, Emily. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I think I've come off mute. Perfect. So we're going to start this journey really in the second part, but how we go from, you know, those second and third, or the two middle sections of that last slide that Emily had about going from compliance or deliberate inclusion towards systemic inclusion, the kind of the ultimate goal. But I need to give you first a tiny brief history lesson about an old but very still relevant theory that continues to be widely used in industrial and organizational psychology and in HR practices. So you can see it's Lewin's person environment fit theory from back in 1936. This is the idea that where someone is doing a job that is commensurate with their skills, their qualifications, their knowledge and experience, you will get excellent performance. So that all sounds great. And that's the person in the middle and their fit. And then in the sort of other concentric circle with the purple, so the environment here, this part really matters. Individuals can be impacted by their physical and emotional surroundings along with the flow of how work is allocated. So, you know, some people have caseloads, other people work on projects with regular deadlines, maybe they have targets. So how is the work organized? And in that intersection between the person environment fit, that's kind of where disability accommodations or adjustments comes in. So maybe it's a noisy open plan office, the person has to sit beside a corridor, like the coffee machine that Emily described earlier. So if you were to have a kind of a workplace needs assessment, they might be recommended to move them somewhere that's a bit quieter, or give them some noise cancelling headphones or something like that if noise is an issue. So how can their workflow be better managed though? So if you're project based, what tools could you have to help them to plan, organise, prioritise their work? Is there support from mentors or buddies? So, you know, adjustments don't have to just be equipment, they can be other people. In the outer ring, so the large orange ring, this is where the workplace HR and communication norms are. So these are your systems, your policies, your practices that create the conditions within which neurominorities, but also the rest of us, have to operate. So some of these systems don't work very well for neurominorities. For example, you know, this idea of being flexible in an open plan, or flexible working policies and practices. So this is where inclusion policies fit in. How do we ensure that as many of our specialist thinkers, and likely many other people, how are they accommodated within the system? So we're going to talk a bit more about universal design for creating that systemic inclusion. But first, let's consider what areas neurominorities actually need support with and the accommodations that we find are typically implemented. So what are the areas that most neurominorities find more challenging when they're carrying out their normal day-to-day activities? So this data is from Genius Within coaching clients and what they usually want to work on in coaching sessions. These are common issues, by the way, across all neurodiverse employees, regardless of the specific type of diagnosis or condition that they have. So whether they're autistic or ADHD, yeah. These are kind of the troughs at the bottom of that spiky profile that Emily described to you earlier on. So by far, as you can see, 92% present with memory and concentration as the thing that they really want support with. We call these executive functions because they are the higher order functions in the brain. Things like organization skills and time management are kind of the consequences really of a not so well functioning memory and concentration ability. What does that look like in the workplace? So Emily described working memory as that very short term sort of scratch pad, which you need to hold information long enough to take a phone message, to listen in a meeting, remember what I've said, could lead to lapses in memory if it's not working too well. In concentration, finding it hard to keep focus at work, obviously, slowing down an ability to make decisions. You could be easily distracted. Anxiety also has been linked to intense or obsessive activity at work, and it can affect your concentration and memory in turn, anxiety. Organization and planning, so, struggling to juggle a number of tasks. Some people also might describe putting off challenging work. It can take longer to do tasks, so the time management, so you're slightly less productive. People often work, neurominorities often report working far longer hours than their colleagues, far longer than their contracted hours. And this is not really sustainable because, they will experience burnout a lot more quickly. It's exhausting. With communication, you might notice more morale problems, a more resigned attitude, wanting to withdraw from communication. So, for example, autistic people find it really hard to constantly be interacting, doing social interaction with people. It's very, very tiring. So they might want to withdraw. They might not want to come to the office Christmas party every year. It can also be linked to uncharacteristic problems with colleagues, maybe being a bit less patient, some overreaction to problems. They might find it harder to accept feedback. So what kinds of adjustments would you be able to make to support individuals to better manage such challenges when they're doing their day-to-day work? So these are the most common adjustments or accommodations that happen at the individual level. They constitute supportive changes that we can make to an individual's workflow or environment. They're the kinds of adjustments that allow organizations to comply with the law. So executive functions coaching, you now know what that is, kind of the memory, the concentration. These can be helped with support for strategies and also with communication as well. Literacy coaching, very important to say, this is not about teaching people to read and write. This is about helping them to develop strategies like producing or using report templates, speed reading techniques, skills for summarizing information, using an alternative method for remembering how a word looks when it's spelled correctly rather than how it sounds. Assistive technology, spell check has really moved on. Emily's also described the other, the dictation and the read aloud functions in Microsoft Word, for example. We use it as a rule now, don't we, spell check? But as she described, for neurominorities, the fear and worry about social expectations is kind of diminished because, like somehow they were cheating before, but now it's okay because we all use it. So these kinds of things are becoming more and more commonplace in technology. Workstation adaptations, pardon me. So these aren't new. We talked about ramps, we talked about specialist chairs, ergonomic mouse, for example. I used to have all that kit when I worked full time. Dyspraxics also experience physical pain when typing or writing, so they might need similar types of workstation adaptations. You might also need to adjust lighting, for example, if people are overwhelmed by the bright lights in their office. Schedule flexibility. So the idea of being able to be flexible in with the hours that people work. So come in early or come in late, leave late to avoid a busy commute. So again, autistic people might be overwhelmed by the commute because there's just so many people around, and by the time they get in the office, they're no good to anyone. Supervisor input. This might include following up verbal guidance with written instructions. giving people clear and actionable feedback delivered in a timely fashion. Formal training, kind of like this, where you're getting some awareness about, what neurodiversity is, what kind of adjustments might be available. Training that can be tailored specifically to the needs of a team or organization. And environmental flexibility. These are usually free and often relate to things like sensory overwhelm. So being seated in a less distracting place on the floor, quieter working pods, which lots of open plan offices kind of have now, don't they? And working from home on occasion, which, let's face it, shouldn't be used as an excuse not to allow someone to work from home anymore. In the UK, at least, employers have been making some of these adjustments, predominantly in a piecemeal fashion, though, for a few decades, but we never really knew much about their effectiveness. Do they work? Who do they work for? To answer this question, Genius Within CEO Dr. Nancy Doyle, she did some research involving a cohort of over 500 neurominority participants. They each recorded which of these adjustments supported them the most. So very quickly on the chat, answers on a postcard. Which ones do you think were the most effective as judged by the participants? Yep, good. Executive function coaching. Any others? Any more for any more? Yep. Okay, great. Top marks to the first two people who said executive functions coaching, environmental flexibility, and supervisor input. They were the ones that made the most difference. Executive functions coaching and environment flexibility in particular were rated quite highly. So by about 90% of people said that they were most helpful. All the others tended to be around 70%, rated by 70% to be helpful, except assistive tech. That was about 50%. And the value of assistive tech to individuals seemed to vary depending on the age of the respondent and whether they'd received any training. So training is really critical. Whenever I do workplace needs assessment now, I say to people, there's no point providing the kit if you're not going to train them up to use it, because it's pretty frustrating not to be able to use it efficiently, and then people will give up. So that's really important that training comes along with the technology. So we talked a lot about coaching. What is this, how is this executive functions coaching and strategy coaching, is it effective? How do we know it works? Does it have any positive effects? So Genius Within delivers a significant amount of coaching to individuals, about 3,000 clients a year. We also deliver co-coaching with managers, as Emily mentioned earlier. So we've been measuring the efficacy of this type of coaching for the last 9 to 10 years. These are our success rates. Just to let you know, the self-ratings are taken pre and post coaching, and the post coaching is around 3 months after, because it takes a little bit of time for strategies to be implemented and then for people to really see the tangible benefits of those. There's a difference you'll see between manager ratings and employee ratings. So that it seems like the employee ratings are a lot higher, or at least the improvement. That's because the starting place is different. So employees have generally lower self-esteem and confidence, and managers often don't realize how hard the employee is already working. So the increased difference, or the improvement, is that basically the manager didn't rate them as low as the employee did themselves. 25% of our coachees were promoted within a year, and there's around a 95% job retention rate, which is pretty high. And for the 5% of people for whom, they're struggling a lot in the job and no kind of adjustments is helping, perhaps they're in the wrong job, and they can be supported to transition to find another job in the same company, or perhaps in another workplace. So the bottom line here is that investing, whoops, that's me scrolling far too fast. Investing time to listen, to support, and offer reasonable adjustments or coaching can make a huge difference. Returning briefly to the concept of person-environment fit, here's a metaphor for a poor fit as a result of a rigid process. Is it appropriate for everyone to be able to climb trees in the savannah? So if you're in charge of a tree climbing team, you might not think the fish was very valuable. If you're the apple picking team manager, you might love the elephant as much as the monkey. But they're all specialists, and they perform extremely well in the right context, just not in every context. So where there's a poor fit, you might notice some uneven performance. In society today, we value very specific abilities or qualities: literacy, numeracy, the ability to sit for excessive long periods, concentrate in a busy environment, interact constantly socially with each other. They're valued quite highly in a lot of societies, though not all. Why would you make everyone go through the same system if they're good at different things and they have different preferences? How can you adapt your processes to allow for people's individual strengths to shine? Think about the end result. Don't just focus on standardized processes, because that's the way we've always done things around here. Or what was good for me, the boss, is good for everyone else. So systemic inclusion is when our workplaces match our communities and our customer base for representation. It's when we have a blend of specialist and generalist roles. Our aim is that employers work towards making workplaces more systemically inclusive so that neurominority employees can be included. I'm going to talk about very quickly, though, the 7 principles of universal design. So this is from the Universal Design for HR Center for Universal Design from the University of North Carolina. In its most straightforward definition, universal design refers to the notion that by creating infrastructure with all abilities and diversity in mind, we can reduce the need for adaptation or accommodation at the individual level. So it's most often referred to in terms of architectural environments for those with physical disabilities. We've already talked about ramps. Universal design for neurominorities is typically focused on assistive technology. Again, we've talked quite a bit about that. But infrastructure is more than just building accessibility and technology. So all these everyday interactions that you have among co-workers and with supervisors, they're influenced heavily by the overarching HR policies and practices. They contain our beliefs and attitudes, and they create this kind of social infrastructure that might either help people or really hinder them. And we can apply universal design principles to those features for neurominority inclusion. So here are the 7 principles created by the Centre for Universal Design. In the following slide, I'm going to talk about the 6 key elements of industrial organization psychology and pick on one particular example, concrete example, which I think everyone will be familiar with. So the interview within the hiring process. What does that look like? How is that disabling for neurominorities? And how can that be different using a universal design approach? So principle 1, equitable use, where everyone experiences the same service or experience, whether they're disabled or not. So we've talked about how, a whole process could we haven't, but perhaps we could talk about how a whole process could be changed. For example, with autism at work type recruitment programs, where, people with autism are specifically encouraged to apply. Many of those companies that have got those programs have often adapted their selection process, and they've found that then autistic people can really demonstrate their skills and abilities. So why don't we think about whether that could just become the standard rather than just be the way we recruit autistic people? So that's about equitable use. Principle 2, flexibility in use. So this is where accommodations for preferences outside the norm are built in. So time tests or time interviews create obstacles for lots of neurominorities because it doesn't test their knowledge or job performance reliably. It's testing something that they probably struggle with a lot, which is processing speed, thinking on their feet, working memory. So the same goes for the pace of e-learning, for example. So you might want someone who talks a lot more quickly like me, or you might want somebody who's like much more measured and calm and collected than Emily. That's just my observation. But for example, some ADHDers prefer to listen at a much quicker pace. Otherwise, they get distracted and lose interest. Whereas a dyspraxic or dyslexic person might prefer to have it slower because it takes a little bit more time for that to sink in. Principle 3, simple and intuitive use. The idea is to avoid unnecessarily complexity and repetition. This also relates to information being laid out clearly and intuitively, which perhaps in kind of the media world, this is quite important. So, not just thinking about the layout of your own manuals, policies and procedures for internally, but also, externally. Could it be more intuitive? Could you have more diagrams, flowcharts and images? Principle 4 is perceptible information. This is about how information is communicated and perceived or received. So is your intranet compatible with accessibility software like speech to text, text to speech? Do you use alternative text descriptions of embedded visual images? This might seem to focus more on people with like hearing or visual impairments, but it's also useful for neurominorities who might find lots of kind of heavy text really difficult to cope with. Principle 5 is tolerance for error. This means allowing mistakes and edits. A possible working memory problem associated with some neurominority conditions means that some people who are otherwise qualified are just less able to self-regulate and see the errors in their work. Is your job application process fit for purpose? Are people allowed to is there a spell check? Are people allowed to copy and paste over from Word? Are they able to review that process before they submit the application? In work, I know there's lots of like legacy type databases which are just clunky and really horrible to learn to use and to train on. I did an assessment with a somebody who worked in government department where it really didn't work for him. There was no tolerance for error, so he'd start typing and the predictive text would try and guess what he was going to put in, and then invariably it might be wrong. But he didn't also have the ability to review that before it kind of was spotted by somebody else. Principle 6, low physical effort. This is targeted at predicting and minimizing physical effort. So we've talked a bit about sensory overwhelm, also dyspraxics kind of maybe having more difficulty when they're doing something that requires maybe fine motor skills. These types of things could be managed better, and that low physical effort can help people to feel less pain, because it actually can be quite physically painful. Principle 7 is size and space for approach and use. This builds on low physical effort and it focuses on the adaptation of environments and workspace. I'd really recommend you look up the BBC Wales new broadcasting house in Cardiff project. So this opened to staff in October 2019. The building was designed with neuro-minority needs in mind and is a great example of inclusive design in consultation with neurominority employees. They ensured that everything from like color, texture, the layout of the building, the lighting, the acoustics were all designed to be neuro-inclusive. And there's some great pictures of it. If you'll be able to find that online, no problem. So universal design isn't a new concept. It's been around quite a long time, since 1997 as it happens. And it isn't actually often used in industrial organizational psychology, but it serves as a really good framework for reviewing HR workplace issues to achieve neuro-inclusivity in a way that can also benefit the majority. So I'm going to try and run through how that will work. These are the 6 key elements of industrial organizational psychology consulting, which relate to the core HR processes within organizations. So from the top, you've got design, hiring, contracting, training, performance review, and well-being. So in designing, you want to avoid things like, structural exclusion by making your job description, for example, really clear and concrete and accessible in a way like when people read it as well, or to have a verbal check to know exactly what people are expected to do. Hiring, ensuring that people can perform at their best, and we're going to go into a bit more detail about that next. Contracting, so again, your terms and conditions of employment. Have you put it through like not just a spell check, but like a kind of language check? So using plain English. There's another piece of software or another function on Word called the Flesch-Kincaid scale, which is built in. You can find it in the editor or spell check thing. And basically what it does is it measures things like length of sentence, whether it's a passive sentence or an active sentence. And it does a readability check so that you can establish whether, how accessible it is to people of different reading abilities. In the UK, you can have a look at the Plain English campaign for training and proofreading as well. If you think about this, the insurance, technology, and financial sectors are kind of being forced to think about how they raise their game in this area. So using plain English, making different versions of their lengthy, boring terms and conditions more accessible to everyone. So we could be doing this for all our colleagues in the workplace and our clients and customers. In the training space, so this is about, for example, making inclusion standards, so sending out information in advance. I already talked about adjusting the speed of e-learning or making sure that it is adjustable so that people can listen at a pace that's more comfortable for them. Performance review, so how do you design your performance review system? Does it recognize skills and strengths that reflects individuals' abilities, or does it penalize them for things that maybe aren't key, like submitting expenses in a particular way on a particular day, a particular time? Just an example. Allow employees to appeal or negotiate where maybe performance ratings have become about by some kind of misunderstanding, a communication breakdown. And finally, well-being. So, lots of big companies anyway have access to employee assistance programs. If you've got provision like that, do you know whether it incorporates specialists who know about hidden disabilities, like neurodiverse conditions? Ensure your provision is well advertised, that there's clear and easy routes to access. Think about the feedback that you get from your neurominorities and other employees so that their voice is captured and acted upon. So what might this look like if we were to take a specific example from out of one of the core HR processes? So hiring. Let's just talk about hiring. We've known for some time through research that the interview isn't actually a very good predictor of success in the job. References are the worst, but interviews are pretty low down. Well, the interview can also be very disabling, very distressing for some minorities. If you've got an articulate dyslexic person, they often present really well because this is their area of strength. However, a challenge in making eye contact or knowing when to stop talking could be evident in an autistic individual. This is very likely to be one of the factors perhaps leading to what Emily showed us earlier, that only 10 to 15% of autistic people have a job in the UK. Most people find interviews difficult and stressful, but this could be much worse for your neurominority colleagues or applicants. They also have directional and spatial orientation issues, which can make finding their way to the interview really anxiety provoking. So, examples of adjustments: make sure you give clear and unambiguous directions to the interview location, or in this day and age, a clear email with Zoom link. So applicants can, practice their route, schedule enough time, be prepared, know what they need to wear, feel less anxious about the environment they're going to be visiting. Photos, images about the location and interior would also be really valuable. These don't take a lot of effort and ensures you can get the best, hopefully, from all your applicants. Next one, try giving them questions in advance. This might sound like cheating, and I know that on another awareness session, I've observed somebody ask a question, but that's not fair because nobody else gets the. Well, is it though? I mean, what exactly are you assessing? Are you assessing their knowledge, their experience, and their skills, or are you actually assessing how quickly they can come up with an answer on the spot when they're struggling with their memory processing? Sensory environment. So any applicant who has sensory overwhelm issues will appreciate a place to step away from the formality of the process. Give them time to gather their thoughts and compose themselves. Mini breaks in between selection tasks, if that's relevant, would also be useful. Relevant tasks. I love this one. Make sure that what you're testing people on is relevant to the job you actually want them to do. So remember the elephant tree climbing cartoon? A friend of mine actually was once asked in an interview for a project manager role, I believe. If you were a cocktail, what kind of cocktail would you be? I don't know the relevance to it. I don't suppose she did either. Maybe it's relevant if you're interviewing a marketeer, you want them to come up with a catchy strapline, or you want your future star bartender to come up with a fancy new drink. But generally speaking, it's probably not relevant to most job roles. And the final one there on the end, bias and homophily. I'm sure you know what bias is: making conscious or unconscious judgments about others based on your personal experience, values taught to you by society and other people who are influential to you in your life. Homophily is the concept of tending to associate with people like ourselves. So this leads to hiring people in your own image or who are more like you, not necessarily the best person for the job. It tends to lead, obviously, to homogeneity within an organization. Unconscious bias training exists, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to support the long-term positive effects of that so far. However, some awareness is better than none. And until we can come up with more robust solutions for unconscious bias, I think it's better to mitigate the risk by having perhaps a diverse panel of interviewers so that any potential biases can be challenged. Nearly there. So if we haven't already convinced you about why universal design and systemic inclusion is critical for your business internally and externally, here are some really interesting facts and figures that highlight the hidden purchasing power that disabled people hold. The US the US data is from a 2018 study by Yin et al, and the UK data is from a really cool website. If you visit, it's called wearepurple.org. So 1 in 5 consumers are disabled. The purchasing power of people with disabilities in the US is 490 billion. In the UK, it's a loss of about 2 billion per month to businesses. 73% of disabled people found accessibility issues in e-commerce. This goes up to 75% when you look at the overall experience, so like customer service and accessibility to bricks and mortar shops. In 2016, a survey found that more than 4 million people in the UK abandoned a retail website because of the accessibility issues they had, taking with them an estimated spend of £11.75 billion. 3 years later, in 2019, that lost business, which they call the click away pound, grew to £17.1 billion. So these are some of the opportunity costs for many businesses when systems, policies, and processes are just more inclusive, not only for employees, but also for your customers. By developing a more inclusive workplace, the new minority specialists that work for you will also feel more enabled to perform at their best, harnessing their creativity to develop improved system services and products. And then in turn, that should, kind of reflect in how you're able to sell to your customers and clients in a more inclusive way for them too. So just to end with, here are just some of the services that and products that Genius Within sell. And some we've already talked about. So coaching, awareness sessions we've talked about. iGenius bundles are a mix of kind of self-directed reflection and one-to-one coaching. Next level neurodiversity is really the service that businesses should be thinking about purchasing to help them with workplace universal design to achieve systemic inclusion. So we do this by raising awareness widely throughout the organization, or you could audit your existing policies and processes, thinking really about that whole life cycle of the employee. Identification support for implementing changes to enable all employees to work at their best. And a bespoke tool for identifying common challenges and accommodations for staff across the whole organization. So creating standard access to adjustments is really essential for systemic inclusion, rather than only when there's a problem identified. And that's what next level neurodiversity is all about. Even if you don't come back to us, obviously we would love it if you did. Just want to bear in mind a few key things when you're commissioning services like this. Remember to check people's credentials and professional expertise. Look for evidence-based practitioners who use feedback and evaluation to confirm the effectiveness of the work that they do. That they've got insurance and got their financial due diligence. And that they have a regulation and complaints process. So we've come to the end of our journey. I can see that I'm probably well over time, so apologise for that. If everyone has had to leave, hopefully they'll be able to view the recording afterwards. But I think, Kirsty, we can, have we got time to do some questions?
Thanks, Georgina. I mean, thank you both, Georgina and Emily. That was just really insightful. One thing that I think I might have misheard, is this correct that only 10% of autistic people in the UK have a job? Did I hear that correctly?
10 to 15.
Crikey, that's a worrying statistic. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it's been amazing. I think hearing about universal design is fascinating, and it seems like it would make sense for everyone in society, not just for neuro minorities. So I wonder if anyone has a question that they would like to ask. You can either ask it on the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute. Would anyone like to ask anything? Fo.
I have a question. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you so much. There's so much information there that everybody else I'd love to kind of take away. I think my question is more as a hiring manager. Often when people come through the interview process, they don't share that they have a some kind of neurodiverse status, or potentially they don't know. And so sometimes it only really comes up when you start to get, tasks that aren't fulfilled in the right way. So I guess my question is, do you have any advice for someone like me who potentially has an undiagnosed person who is continually sort of missing the mark in terms of what their work or output is meant to be, and how to have the discussion around potentially being checked, is that even appropriate? What do I do in that case? Because there are very clear processes for performance review and things like that, but there's not a very clear process for even trying to figure out if this person is going through something.
I don't know what George wants to offer to this, but basically I think the thing is to stick to the principles of good feedback, to talk about what you see and what you hear, and open up the conversation, and see where it goes.
And so, just so I'm hearing that correctly, would it be appropriate for me ever to ask? So if it's a continual thing, because I guess I would be conscious that potentially the environment that is set up for this person is not right, or potentially the role as it evolves is also not quite right. So would it ever be appropriate for me to ask if any testing had been in place or not?
I think I would open up the conversation and explore it, and say, this is what you've seen in terms of performance. What is the person's perspective, and see if they do offer that information. I probably wouldn't come out straight away with, have you been tested for anything? I would see where that conversation went, really. We often have discussions with people about disclosure and the pros and cons, and I generally support disclosure. I think it's also about almost kind of doing it right from the beginning as well, ensuring that it's the kind of organisation where people up at the top are very open about any neurodiverse condition that they have, that it's just something that's talked about a lot. And so that would kind of encourage people to reveal if they'd had a diagnosis at that stage. I don't know what George, what you would say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emily that culture is really important, and if it's it feels like a supportive approach rather than one that's kind of trying to identify any particular issues.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah, is there a problem? Can we fix that? But more, if the person also recognizes that they aren't meeting the requirements as they understand it, and this is the other thing perhaps to clarify out at the outset, do they know what, I know this sounds a bit silly, but do they know actually what the requirements are, like what they need to do in order to meet the performance requirements? Is that absolutely clear, crystal clear? Because a lot of our coaches find that when they're doing co-coaching with managers, for example, and managers and employees, that there's sometimes kind of, in job descriptions, I'm sure you have experienced this yourself, it's like, well, sometimes they're pretty vague, aren't they? And then even when it comes to doing objectives or to doing your performance plan, sometimes those things can be a bit ambiguous and they can be misinterpreted. So I think starting from that kind of foundation, just to be clear that everybody understands the same thing. And I think once you've got to that point and it's still not working, then you might have to take it up to the next level, that we'd like to support you to do this, but we're not really sure how we can. Is there anything that you'd like for us to do? Are there any health conditions that we need to know about? Because and we're not asking because we're nosy, but we're asking to make sure that you feel like everything is being covered.
Okay, that's great, thanks. I think the language sensitivity is probably been the most helpful thing in the response there. Yeah, cheers, thank you.
Thanks, Bo. Does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap up? I can see a hand raised. Hang on. I can't see whose it is.
I think it's mine.
Oh,
Betsy, thank you so much for today. I think it's brilliant and just raising more awareness to all of us, really. I had a question in terms of just the data that I think, Emily, you were sharing at the beginning around the numbers and the percentages of people with the neurodiverse conditions. And do you feel that those numbers are increasing with time, or is that based on environmental factors, hereditary things? Is it the fact that people are just being diagnosed now that perhaps years before they weren't? So is there a reason perhaps that numbers may fluctuate?
I don't know, but I've got some ideas, and I think we've got much better at diagnosing. We've got much better at diagnosing children, and when that happens, often then the parents may seek a diagnosis. So I think more people are actually being diagnosed. I think it's an interesting question about, kind of economic environments. It's an interesting question about post-COVID, if we're going to see a lot more redundancies, so I don't know about whether they've increased or not, to be honest, but I'm not sure. But I do know, I think that more and more people are getting diagnosed. I'd imagine the incidence is actually probably pretty static. It's just that more people are being diagnosed, but that's just my personal feeling.
Yeah, and then I guess
I don't know whether George wants to comment on that.
No, not really.
I guess
you know what, you foxed us, Claire. That was a great question.
Right. I was just thinking maybe that people feel more confident to actually go and get help if they think there might be an issue, and comfortability that they feel that they can do it in a safe
Absolutely.
Space.
So I remember working in the Welsh Valleys I'm in Cardiff at the moment, about 20 years ago, and lots of miners would come out, weren't able to mine anymore, and high proportion, I'd imagine, would had dyslexia, never been diagnosed. It just wasn't picked up in school. So it's become much more, still not great, but it has become, much more freely available to be diagnosed now. Yeah,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Claire. So we have a question I'll read out from the chat from Naomi saying, could options be explored, for example, coaching and adjustments for an employee without them actually having an identified condition?
Well, this is very interesting because we often have this argument, because in order to be covered by the Equality Act, you do not have to have a diagnosis. You just have to be covered by the Equality Act in terms of having long-term memory, long-term processing speed issues that are likely to last 12 months. So you don't actually have to have that diagnosis.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
So the employer only needs to have, or an employer and employee kind of need only to have a suspicion or a concern that there is an issue for adjustments to be put in place. So what Emily's saying is correct. So there's no specific requirement for a diagnosis or for a condition to be identified specifically.
That's interesting, thank you.
And often we unfortunately get people who are sent for re-diagnosis, even if they were maybe diagnosed at university, they then get sent for another diagnosis, and there's just no need. It's waste of money, unless there's a feeling there may be something else going on. I talked about the overlap.
Thank you. I think actually we should probably wrap up now because we are slightly over time. So thank you so much to Emily and Georgina from Genius Within, and to the brilliant Jackie Wallace, my friend at Genius Within, who's just been so wonderful at helping set up all of our collaborations with the IAA. It's been really great to have everyone here. We have another session next week on intersectionality, which I really hope people will be able to join as well. And I think just keep in touch if anyone has any questions or would like to speak to Genius Within. Perhaps you could get in touch with Jackie, and just be great to keep in touch, and hopefully we'll see you at our event next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.